Every person you have ever admired is also someone you do not fully know. The question this story asks is what happens when someone stops pretending that isn't true. Every person carries within them a version of themselves they would prefer the world never saw. Not a monster, not a villain, simply the unedited self, the impulses before they are softened, the thoughts before they are made acceptable. We spend enormous energy managing the distance between who we are in private and who we present in public. Most of the time, the effort is invisible. Most of the time, the mask holds. But what if the mask could be removed entirely? What if there were a way to separate the respectable self from the hidden one, to let each exist independently, without compromise? That is the question Robert Louis Stevenson placed at the center of one of the most enduring stories in the English language. And the answer, when it arrives, is devastating. Victorian London was a city built on surfaces. Reputation was everything. A gentleman's standing depended not on what he felt, but on what he displayed: propriety, restraint, moral seriousness. The drawing rooms were immaculate, the handshakes were firm, and beneath it all an entire city understood, without ever saying so, that respectability was a performance. It was a culture that rewarded control above all else. And in that culture, Dr. Henry Jekyll was a perfect success. Jekyll was a physician, a scientist, a man of considerable wealth and impeccable reputation. He was generous, well-liked and trusted. His home was elegant. His friends were distinguished. By every visible measure, he had achieved precisely the life that Victorian society demanded. But Jekyll knew something about himself that his reputation could never contain. He knew that his appetites, his darker curiosities, his less admirable instincts, they had not disappeared. They had simply been suppressed, pushed down year after year beneath the polished surface of a respectable life. The story does not begin with Jekyll. It begins with his friend, a lawyer named Gabriel John Utterson, a man of habit, caution, and quiet loyalty. Utterson is our guide through the fog, and the first thing he encounters is a door. A plain, neglected door set into the side of a building on a back street. No bell, no knocker, stained and weathered. It is the kind of door a respectable person walks past without a second glance. Utterson's cousin, a man named Enfield, tells him a story about that door. Late one night, he witnessed something disturbing. A small, pale man walked directly into a young girl at a street corner. He did not stop. He did not apologize. He simply trampled over her and continued walking. Enfield confronted the man, and what struck him was not the act itself, but the feeling the man provoked. There was something wrong about him, something that made the skin crawl, a quality that could not be named but could not be ignored. The man's name was Edward Hyde, and the door he disappeared through led directly into the home of Dr. Henry Jekyll. When Enfield finished speaking, Utterson said almost nothing, but something had begun to trouble him, because Utterson already knew that name. He had seen it recently in a private document. Jekyll's will. In it, Jekyll had left everything, his entire estate, to Edward Hyde. Utterson began to investigate. Not formally, he was too discreet for that. But he watched. He walked the streets near the door at night. He asked careful questions of careful people. Eventually he encountered Hyde in person. The meeting was brief and deeply unsettling. Hyde was small, young-seeming, and somehow difficult to describe. People who met him struggled to articulate what was wrong. He was not deformed. He was not grotesque. He simply produced, in everyone who came near him, an instinctive revulsion, a sense that something fundamental was missing. Utterson confronted Jekyll, gently, as a friend. He expressed concern about the will, about Hyde, about the strangeness of the whole arrangement. Jekyll smiled, reassured him, and asked him to drop the subject. He said he could be rid of Hyde any time he chose. He asked Utterson to trust him, and because Utterson was a loyal man, and because Jekyll was convincing, the matter was, for the moment, set aside. But the unease did not go away. It sat quietly in the background of every subsequent conversation, every dinner invitation, every reassurance. Something was wrong in that house, and Utterson could feel it, even if he could not yet see it. Then came the act that changed everything. A distinguished gentleman, Sir Danvers Carew, was found dead on a London street. A maidservant had witnessed the attack from a window. She described a small man, a man she recognized as Edward Hyde, who had struck Carew with a heavy walking cane in an outburst of sudden, overwhelming fury. The cane was found broken at the scene. Half of it was recovered nearby. It had been a gift. From Utterson to Jekyll years before, Hyde vanished. His rooms in Soho were found abandoned, half-burned papers in the grate. The police searched, but found nothing. Jekyll, meanwhile, seemed to recover. He emerged from a period of seclusion looking healthier, more sociable, more like his old self. He hosted dinners. He attended to his friends. He even began speaking openly about breaking off his connection with Hyde. For a brief time, Utterson allowed himself to believe that the worst was over. It was not. Jekyll withdrew again, this time completely. He locked himself in his laboratory and refused to see anyone. His servants grew frightened. His oldest friend, Dr. Lanyon, had a private encounter with something connected to Jekyll that left him so shaken he fell ill and died within weeks. Before dying, Lanyon left Utterson a letter, sealed, with instructions that it should not be opened until after Jekyll's own death or disappearance. The house grew quieter. The servants heard pacing behind the laboratory door, hours of it, day and night. They heard a voice that was not quite their master's. When Utterson finally forced the door, they found Hyde's body on the floor, a vial in his hand. Jekyll was nowhere to be found. On the desk lay two documents. One was Lanyon's account. The other was Jekyll's own confession. Jekyll's confession is the heart of the story, and it is not a confession of madness. It is, in many ways, the most rational account in the entire book. Jekyll had long observed in himself what he believed to be a universal truth, that every human being is not one person, but two, a moral self and an immoral self, bound together in constant, exhausting negotiation. He did not believe he was uniquely wicked. He believed he was uniquely honest about the division. His experiment was an attempt to resolve that tension. He developed a compound, a chemical formula, that could separate one nature from the other. When he drank it for the first time, the transformation was immediate. He became smaller, younger, unburdened. He felt a rush of freedom that was, he admitted, intoxicating. He had become Edward Hyde, not a different person, but the same person, stripped of conscience, stripped of restraint, stripped of every social accommodation he had ever learned. At first, Jekyll controlled the process. He could become Hyde and return to himself at will. The transformation seemed manageable. He could indulge his hidden nature and then reassemble his respectable identity as though nothing had happened. It was, he believed, the best of both worlds, the perfect arrangement, for a time. But Hyde grew stronger. Each time Jekyll released him, Hyde returned with more force, more appetite, more resistance to being put away again. The transformations began to happen without the formula. Jekyll would fall asleep as himself and wake as Hyde. The compound that had once freed him became the only thing keeping him tethered to his original identity, and the supply was running out. This is the quiet horror at the center of Stevenson's story. Not the violence, not the transformation itself, but the loss of control. Jekyll did not create a monster. He uncaged a part of himself and discovered that it did not wish to be caged again. Hyde was never a separate creature. He was the part of Jekyll that had been denied, compressed and locked away for an entire lifetime. And when he was finally given room to exist, he expanded to fill every space available. Jekyll's final hours were spent barricaded in his laboratory, desperately mixing a formula that no longer worked, listening to Hyde's voice emerge from his own throat. He wrote his confession knowing it would be found after his death, knowing that by the time Utterson read it, the man who had written it would already be gone. Stevenson published this story in 1886. It was an immediate sensation. Within weeks, the names Jekyll and Hyde had entered common language, where they remain to this day. But the popular understanding of the story, the idea of a good man who becomes a monster, misses something essential. Jekyll was never simply good. Hyde was never purely external. The whole point of the experiment was that Hyde already existed inside Jekyll. He always had. What Stevenson understood, decades before modern psychology gave it formal language, was that repression is not the same as resolution. Suppressing a part of your nature does not make it disappear. It makes it concentrated, it makes it patient, and when it finally finds an outlet, it arrives with the accumulated force of everything that was never expressed. Jekyll's mistake was not that he acknowledged his darker self. His mistake was believing he could separate it out cleanly, indulge it on his own terms, and then put it back. He treated his own complexity as an engineering problem, and the solution destroyed him. We still live in a culture that rewards surfaces. We curate our public selves with extraordinary care. We present composure, competence, control, and we push the rest, the doubts, the contradictions, the parts that do not fit the image, somewhere out of sight. Stevenson's warning is not that those hidden parts are evil. His warning is that they are real, and that the longer we pretend they do not exist, the less control we have over them when they finally surface. The fog lifts over London. The door on the back street stands closed. The laboratory is quiet. And somewhere, in the careful silence between who we show the world and who we know ourselves to be, the story continues. Not because it is a tale about a monster, but because it is a tale about a man who believed he could be two people, and discovered, too late, that the one he had starved was the